For 12 years, Elias Reed kept every room in his ranch house ready for a life that was never coming back. The beds were made. The parlor was swept. The good china stayed behind glass, untouched, except for the careful dusting he gave it on the first Monday of each month. He slept in the small room behind the kitchen because it was easier to hear the stove cooling than to hear the silence waiting down the hall. Then, a practical widow from the church sewing circle came up his porch steps with 2 loaves of bread, looked past his shoulder at all those closed doors, and asked a question no one in Dry Creek had dared to ask. Why does a man with this much house live like he is hiding from it? Elias did not answer her that day. He had spent years learning how to keep his sorrow orderly. But Clara Whitcomb had a way of treating locked doors as if they were not endings, only work for the hands and courage for the heart. The Reed place sat 3 miles west of town, where the road bent around cottonwoods and opened into grassland marked by fence wire, windmill shadows, and cattle trails. Elias had worked that land since he was 22, first beside his father, then beside hired boys, and at last, mostly alone. He knew which gate sagged after rain, which trough froze first, which cow would push a weak rail if she sensed a gap. Outside, he repaired everything, because a ranch did not excuse grief. A cracked board had to be replaced. A pump leather had to be changed. Hay had to be stacked tight enough to shed weather. But inside the house, nothing changed. The braided rug stayed where Anna, his wife, had placed it. Her Bible rested by the east window with pressed clover between the pages. The front bedroom, the parlor, the upstairs room, and even the stair door remained closed, polished, and unused, as if the whole house had been holding its breath since she died. Dry Creek called Elias a good man, and that was true as far as it went. He paid his account at Barlow's Mercantile on the first Saturday of every month. He brought beef to the pastor's family each winter. When the schoolhouse roof lost shingles, he appeared at sunrise with a ladder and a sack of nails, then left before anyone could make a speech over him. He sat near the back of church, always on the aisle, brushed clean, boots shined, face still as fence posts in January. Women sent him pies, beans, pickles, and once a crocheted lap blanket because Mrs. Barlow said he looked cold, even in July. He returned every plate washed and every kindness answered. But he never stayed for supper, never crossed a threshold unless duty required it, and never gave the town a reason to think he wanted more than brief words at the hitching rail. Clara Whitcomb arrived in Dry Creek in late February with a wagon full of trunks, a treadle sewing machine, a flour sack of starter, and a milk cow tied behind her brother Nathan's team. She was 54, 3 years widowed, and not made fragile by either fact. Her husband Thomas had died after a winter sickness back in Missouri, and Clara had stayed there until the rooms of that house began to feel like questions she could no longer answer. Nathan wrote that he needed help keeping house while his wife was away caring for family, and Clara came west with her sewing, her mother's green glass button box, and the habit of noticing what needed mending before anyone else saw the tear. She wore her widowhood like she wore her apron, tied firm enough to work in. She did not ask the world to pity her, and she did not let the world waste much time. Within 2 weeks, Clara had curtains washed at Nathan's place, bean rows planned behind the cooper's shed, and a place at the church sewing table on Wednesday afternoons. The women learned quickly that she did not chatter to fill a room, but when she spoke, the room tended to listen. She hemmed trousers for bachelors, mended school coats, traded bread for eggs, and told Mrs. Barlow that pretty calico was fine for a Sunday ribbon, but kitchen curtains needed backbone. That was where Elias first truly noticed her, standing near the stove, blacking in the mercantile, trying not to smile at the phrase. Clara saw the smile before he could put it away. "You disagree, Mr. Reed?" she asked. "I was thinking curtains with backbone sound like something this county could use," he said. "This county and a number of its men," she answered, and Mrs. Barlow suddenly found great interest in sorting thread. Their first proper conversation came over a torn altar cloth. The pastor's wife asked Elias to carry a crate of linens to Nathan's shed, where Clara had better light and a long table for repairs. He expected to leave the crate and go, but Clara stood in the doorway with flour on one wrist and a measuring tape around her neck. She lifted the altar cloth, ran her thumb along the tear, and said, "This can be set right. It only needs patience." Elias answered that patience was one thing the church ladies had in plenty. Clara looked up. Not the ladies. The cloth. Something close to a smile touched his mouth. "Then I expect the cloth is fortunate." Clara bent to her work. "Fortunate things still need hands." He drove home with those words following him down the road, bothersome not because they were sweet, but because they were true. The first visit to his house happened because of bread. Clara had baked too much for a church supper after a family with 6 children stayed home with colds. 2 loaves steam against the evening air. Nathan offered to eat them by morning, and Clara told him that was exactly why she was taking them elsewhere. The road to the Reed place was muddy from a passing shower. When she reached the yard, she found firewood stacked by size, harness hung oiled in the shed, tin pails upside down on a bench, and a house too large for the stillness around it. The windows had no curtains. The front glass reflected the sky like closed eyes. Elias came from the barn with hay dust on his sleeves and a wary look, as if visitors were weather he had not planned for. "I brought bread," Clara said, holding out the flour sack. "There was extra after supper." Elias took it carefully. "I thank you." "You needn't thank me until you know whether it turned out well. Bread from your hands is likely not a gamble." "That is dangerously close to a compliment, Mr. Reed. I will try to be more careful." He asked if she would take coffee, and she said she would if it was already made, which trapped him in manners. The kitchen was clean, scrubbed, and plain. One chair sat pulled out. One cup rested by the basin. Plates were stacked in pairs on the shelf as if the second of everything had been kept out of duty, not expectation. Clara noticed the closed doors along the hall, each knob dulled more by disuse than by neglect. She noticed Elias noticing her notice. They drank coffee strong enough to make Clara's eyebrows rise. She talked of the church supper, Nathan nearly dropping 3 pies, and a boy who had lost a biscuit in the gravy tureen. Elias listened more than he spoke, but he listened well. When she mentioned the church hall curtains had faded through, he said morning sun did that faster than afternoon sun because the windows faced east. When she said a child tore his jacket climbing cottonwoods, Elias said boys should be charged by the branch. He gave small answers, but they fit. Then Clara asked for a cloth to wrap the second loaf, and he opened a drawer too quickly. Inside lay folded towels embroidered with initials that were not his. He shut it and opened another. Clara pretended not to see the way his shoulders tightened. On a first visit, a woman could knock, but she had no right to force the latch. When she rose to go, Clara paused by the kitchen doorway. "Your house is larger than I remembered from the road." Elias looked toward the hall. "It was built for more than one." "Many houses are." The words were mild, but they touched something. He walked her to the wagon as the sky darkened over the pasture. "You drove out alone," he said. "I did." "Roads soft near the wash." "I noticed." "Could have sent word with Nathan." "Bread does not travel well by word." He stood in the yard after she left, holding the empty coffee cup she had carried out by mistake. He did not realize it was still in his hand until her wagon had disappeared around the cottonwoods. The next morning, Elias ate Clara's bread with butter and a jar of chokecherry preserves Anna had made the year before she died. He had kept that jar on the shelf so long the wax seal had darkened, saving it for an occasion that never seemed worthy. The bread was tender with a crisp crust, and the preserves tasted like late summer, bees in the garden, and Anna laughing over a bowl. Memory rose quickly, but for once, it did not flatten him. It came with the smell of yeast and the scrape of a chair on the floor, and the plain fact that good food was meant to be eaten before it spoiled. He finished one slice, then another. On Wednesday, he returned Clara's towel at the church hall, folded sharp as a ledger page. "Obliged for the bread," he said. "Was it worth the risk?" she asked. Elias glanced at the women bent very hard over their sewing. "I would risk it again." After that, bread became a reason. Not every week, not by formal arrangement, and never with tenderness spoken aloud. Clara might send a loaf through Nathan, or Elias might stop by the cooper's shed with a sack of meal and leave with biscuits wrapped in brown paper. Once, when Clara's stove smoked badly, Elias replaced the pipe cap and refused payment. She paid him anyway, with apple butter and a lecture on men who believed gratitude could be settled with a nod. Their conversation stayed on ordinary ground. Weather, seed potatoes, cattle prices, church repairs, the school teacher's need for a new map, and Nathan's habit of losing pencils behind his ear. But ordinary talk, returned to often enough, becomes a bridge. Clara learned that Elias distrusted any almanac promising certainty. Elias learned that Clara could sharpen scissors better than her brother and had once delivered a calf after Thomas sprained his ankle and the hired boy fainted. By May, Clara had visited the Reed kitchen 4 times. Each visit, the closed doors waited beyond them. Each visit, Elias saw her see them. She never asked in town and never used his life as sewing circle thread. She simply brought practical things. Pickled beans, beeswax for sticky drawers, dill seed because the south fence had soil fit for herbs. One afternoon, she held a strip of blue-checked fabric against the kitchen window. She said, "The window already has glass," Elias answered. "Glass keeps out weather. Curtains soften a room. A room does not need softening. Every room does if people are expected to stay in it. I am not expecting people." That explains the coffee. He should have been offended. Instead, the remark landed like a pebble dropped into a well, and the sound took a long time to return. The blue-checked curtains appeared 2 Mondays later. Clara arrived with bread, a parcel of cloth, a small tin of nails, and the calm expression of a woman prepared to outlast resistance. Elias said he had not agreed to curtains. Clara said a man could disagree from the barn as well as from the kitchen. He left because staying would have meant admitting he did not know how to win. When he returned at noon, the curtains hung at the window, tied back with plain cord. They did not change the kitchen, or so he told himself. Yet when afternoon light passed through them, the table looked less like a place to set a plate and more like a place to sit. Clara was warming soup at the stove. "You owned no curtain rods," she said. "I owned peace." "You owned 2 crooked nails and string in a drawer." "I made do." He washed his hands slowly. "You are a determined woman, Mrs. Whitcomb. I have had to be. Summer tested the county with heat and thin grass. Men watched the sky as if staring could draw rain. Women saved dishwater for gardens and covered wells against dust. Elias worked from before sunrise until stars sharpened, moving cattle, checking water, patching troughs, hauling feed, and pretending age had not begun to keep its own ledger. One afternoon, while lifting grain, his back seized and drove him against the barn wall. He did not fall, but by evening he could not straighten without gripping the table. Clara discovered it because he missed church, something he had done only for snow, sickness, or a sick animal. After service, she borrowed Nathan's wagon and drove west with chicken stew, biscuits, liniment, and a face that would not welcome excuses. Elias opened the door pale around the mouth and annoyed at being seen that way. Clara stepped inside before he invited her. "Sit," she said. "I am able." "I did not ask what you were able to do."
"I said sit." "Mrs. Whitcomb, Mr. Reed, if you make me set this stew down and fetch Nathan, I will be cross, and neither of us wants to learn what that looks like." He sat. She moved through the kitchen as if she had been born knowing where things belonged. She set the stew on the stove, filled the kettle, found liniment by smell, and cut a strip from an old towel for a warm compress. He protested 3 times. She ignored 2 and answered the 3rd by asking where he kept clean spoons. His back was strained, not ruined, but loneliness had taught him to turn pain into privacy. Clara would not permit it. She made him eat, made him drink water instead of coffee, and made him admit which chores could wait until morning. "I have cattle," he said. "Cattle will not perish because you sit for one evening. They might disagree. Then they can write me a letter." He laughed, short and surprised, and the sound softened his face before he remembered himself. Clara turned to the stove to give him privacy. She understood the embarrassment of needing help. After Thomas died, neighbors had carried things through her house without asking, and she had stood there feeling like a guest at a sorrowful inn. Help could feel like kindness, but it could also feel like proof that life had taken one's place away. When she gathered her things, Elias said her name for the first time. Not Mrs. Whitcomb. Clara. It came out rough and careful. She stopped with her hand on the latch. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome, Elias." For the next week, Nathan helped with heavier chores, though everyone knew Clara had arranged it. She came in the evenings with supper and no fuss. Sometimes she read aloud from the newspaper when Elias's eyes grew tired in lamplight. The stories were small: a bridge planned 2 counties over, a prize hog sold for a foolish sum, a visiting speaker who lost his hat to the wind and chased it half a block while preaching self-command. Elias listened, smiling into his cup. One night, rain finally came. It began as a tapping on the roof, then grew into a steady wash that made the kitchen smell of wet dust and opened earth. Clara was darning a sock by the stove when Elias said, "Anna loved rain." Her needle paused. He had never spoken his wife's name to her before. She said it made the whole world sound forgiven. Clara lowered the sock into her lap. "That is a fine way to hear it." "How long has she been gone?" Clara asked. 12 years, this coming September." Rain pressed against the windows. Elias looked toward the hallway and the closed rooms beyond it. "I kept thinking if I changed nothing, I would not lose any more. Foolish, I suppose." Clara's answer came quietly. "Not foolish, only costly." He turned that over. "Costly, not foolish." It was the first word anyone had given him that did not shame him for grieving or excuse him from living. He leaned back, tired from pain and confession, while Clara resumed darning. Her needle moved in and out of wool, making a worn place hold. Neither of them spoke for a long while, but the silence had changed. It no longer stood between them like a fence. It sat with them like weather passing over. When Elias's back improved, he expected the visits to fade. They did not. Clara came less often, but not less surely. She brought bread, accepted coffee she had begun quietly weakening, and walked the yard with him as evenings cooled. He showed her the orchard Anna had planted behind the house. 6 apple trees and 1 pear, all twisted by wind but still bearing. Clara examined the trunks, declared 2 in need of pruning, and returned with a saw small enough for her hand and sharp enough to make Elias uneasy. He held the latter while she cut dead wood with brisk confidence. "You have done this before," he said. "Trees and people both grow better when what is dead stops taking all the light. I'm trying to decide if that is about the pear tree. Take your time." The orchard became their first shared project, not because either named it so, but because both returned to it. By August, the first apples colored red at the shoulders. Clara made sauce in his kitchen, and the smell filled the house so richly that Elias stepped onto the porch to breathe through the memory. Clara found him there at dusk. "Too much?" she asked. "Enough to remember." "Remembering can be heavy." He gripped the porch rail. "It was heavy before you came." She stood beside him, not touching, not crowding. Fireflies blinked above the grass beyond the yard, and cattle moved as dark shapes near the fence. He wanted to say more, but the words did not know the road out. Clara did not hurry them. That was another thing he had come to trust. She asked hard questions, but she never dragged an answer from him before it could stand. The matter came to a head over curtains again. In September, the church received donated fabric from a family heading east, including a length of cream cotton with tiny blue flowers. Clara took it home and, after 3 evenings of thought, cut it into panels for the Reed parlor windows. She arrived with them folded in a basket. Elias was mending harness in the barn. He looked up and said, "You have the look of a woman with a plan." "I have several. Only one concerns you." "That is rarely comforting." "Your parlor curtains are in the cedar chest, I imagine?" His hand stopped on the leather. "Why do you imagine that?" "Because your front windows are bare, and Anna strikes me as a woman who would not leave a parlor bare unless someone folded the curtains away." Elias set down the awl. "Clara?" "I made new ones." "No!" The word came hard, faster than he meant it. Clara held the basket against her waist. A lesser woman might have retreated. A more foolish one might have pushed. Clara only stood still. "All right," she said. The ease of her answer unsettled him. "All right?" "I will not hang curtains in a room you forbid me to enter." "It is not about forbidding." "Then what is it about?" He looked past her to the house. Sunlight flashed on the blank parlor windows. "That room is as Anna left it." Clara's voice softened, but the question did not. "And has it comforted you, Elias? Or has it only kept you company in your pain?" His jaw tightened. He picked up the harness because leather was easier than truth. "You should go." Clara nodded once, set the basket on the workbench, and said, "The curtains can stay here until you know whether you want light in that room." For 3 days, Clara did not come. Elias worked with a stubbornness that fooled nobody, least of all himself. The kitchen felt larger. The blue-checked curtains moved in the breeze like they had an opinion. On Sunday, he went to church and sat in his usual pew. Clara sat near the front with Nathan, singing low and steady, and did not turn around. By evening, being right had brought Elias no peace. He lit a lamp, walked down the hall, and opened the parlor door. The room smelled of cedar, dust, and old lavender. Sheets covered the chairs. Anna's small organ stood near the wall. A framed sampler read, "Let kindness dwell here," stitched by her sister in blue thread. Elias stepped inside like an intruder in his own house. The boards creaked under his boots. He lifted the sheet from the sofa and remembered Anna sitting there with mending in her lap while he read cattle prices from the newspaper. He remembered her pretending to care about the market, then throwing a spool of thread at him when he accused her of drifting. She had missed on purpose. The memory came so plainly that he had to sit. He did not weep loudly. He put his elbows on his knees and covered his face while years of held breath left him in rough, quiet waves. He wept for Anna, for suppers never shared, for children who never came, for the man he had become. Faithful in the ways that kept a grave tended and absent in the ways that might have kept a home alive. When it passed, the lamp was low, and the room no longer felt preserved. It felt waiting. The next morning, Elias went to Clara's door with the basket in his hands. Nathan opened, took one look at him, and called for his sister without asking questions. Clara came from the back room with flour on her forearms. Elias held out the basket. I opened the parlor. Her face changed, not with triumph, but with care. Did you? It needs curtains. I can come tomorrow. The question cost him more than he expected. Could you come today? She wiped her hands on her apron and reached for her shawl. They drove to the ranch in near silence. At the house, Elias unlocked the front door instead of taking her through the kitchen. That mattered. Clara noticed, and because she noticed, she said nothing. Sunlight fell through bare parlor glass, hard and pale. Clara entered gently, not like a woman claiming victory, but like a guest in a chapel. She looked at Anna's Bible, the organ, the sampler, the folded sheets. She had good hands, Clara said. Yes. And a fondness for blue. Yes. Then blue flowers will do. They worked without hurry. Elias held the rods while Clara fastened the cloth. The first panel softened the window. The second changed the light from glare to glow. When both were tied back, the room seemed to exhale. It was still Anna's parlor, but not only Anna's. It was a room with air in it, a room where someone might sit without apologizing to the past. At noon, Clara insisted they eat bread and cheese there, because a room should begin its second life with crumbs. They spoke of Anna for nearly an hour. Clara asked only what Elias offered. He told her Anna sang off-key, planted beans too close together, and believed every stray cat was a sign from Providence. Clara told him Thomas whistled one tune for 27 years and never found the last notes. It was the first time she had spoken of her husband in that house. The two dead sat with them gently, not as shadows, but as witnesses to the strange mercy of being remembered without being used as chains. From then on, the house changed faster than Elias expected and slower than Clara wished, which made the pace about right. The parlor opened on Sundays. The pastor and his wife came for supper. Mrs. Barlow arrived the next week and tried so hard not to look astonished that Elias took pity and told her she could admire the curtains if she needed to. The spare room opened because of a storm. A traveling school examiner and his wife were caught by washed-out roads, and the small inn was full. The pastor asked Elias if he could spare a room. Clara stood nearby, rolling bandages by the church stove, and did not look at him. That restraint decided him. He said he could. The room smelled closed when he opened it, but Clara came with lavender water, clean sheets, and necessity in both hands. They aired the mattress over the porch rail, beat dust from the rug, washed the window, and found that the cracked pitcher still held water if filled below the flaw. Elias stood in the doorway while Clara made the bed. "Anna wanted this room ready," he said. Clara tucked the sheet tight. "Then let it be ready." The examiner's wife left a note thanking him for the kindest bed west of the river. Elias carried the note in his coat pocket for 3 days before placing it on the mantel. Opening rooms did not heal him all at once. Some mornings, Elias woke cross and ashamed of needing anyone. Some evenings, Clara returned to Nathan's house and sat still at her sewing machine, frightened by how much she had begun to hope. They were not young lovers with empty pages ahead. They were older people with names written all through their histories, and every tender step raised questions no one else could answer. Could love be honorable after long grief? Could a house hold 2 sets of memories without making either one smaller? Could a widow accept warmth without feeling she had misplaced the man she buried? Could a rancher take another hand without loosening the one that once held his? They did not speak of marriage then. They spoke of winter stores, dried apples, tar paper for Nathan's roof, the church stove that smoked, and whether a man who burned green wood indoors ought to be made to split kindling for a month. Beneath the talk ran another question. Will you be there when the cold comes? Will you let me be there too? The upstairs north room remained untouched. Elias called it the north room, if he had to call it anything. Clara knew from a tender remark by Mrs. Barlow that Anna had once planned it as a nursery, though no child had ever come to fill it. Some empty rooms are not empty because someone left. Some are empty because hope stood there and waited until waiting itself became pain. Clara did not ask about it. Winter did. The first snow came early, just after Thanksgiving, soft at dawn and serious by afternoon. Clara was at the Reed place helping Elias sort apples in the pantry because several had bruised and needed using. She meant to leave before dark, but the sky lowered fast. Wind pushed snow against the porch and blurred the road to town. Elias looked west and came back with white on his shoulders. You should stay until it eases. Nathan will worry. I can ride in and tell him. You will not ride in that. Clara weighed propriety against weather. Dry Creek had generous hearts and busy tongues, and a widow staying in a rancher's house overnight would be discussed from church steps to feed bins. Elias seemed to read her thoughts. The spare room is yours. I will sleep in the kitchen chair if that eases your mind. Your back will not survive that kind of nobility. My reputation may. At our age, Mr. Reed, reputations are quilts other people sew from scraps. They sent word to Nathan through a young ranch hand passing before the road closed completely. As evening deepened, the house filled with the intimate sounds of weather. Snow hissed against the windows. The stove breathed heat. Clara made apple dumplings with dough rolled thin on the kitchen table. Elias peeled apples badly until she showed him how to turn the fruit instead of sawing at it like fence wood. Later, they sat in the parlor while the lamps burned gold. Near midnight, a draft slipped under the stair door and Clara rose to tuck a rug against it. Elias watched her hand near the latch. The north room waited above them. Rooms do not call, but grief can make a ceiling feel heavy. Clara turned back. Cold coming down the stairs. The upper rooms lose heat. You keep them closed. Yes. She did not ask why. Her restraint, after all these months, undid him more than pressure would have. Anna wanted children, Elias said. Clara stood still. So did I. We had names chosen once. Jacob, if a boy. Ruth, if a girl. The years passed. The doctor said there was no reason he could find, as if that should comfort us. It did not. The lamp flame shifted in the draft. She made yellow curtains for the north room anyway. Said a room did not have to know its purpose yet to deserve sunlight. After she died, I closed it. I could not bear that kind of waiting. Clara came back to her chair but did not sit. May I tell you something? He nodded. Thomas and I had one child, a boy named Samuel. He lived 3 days. The words entered the room quietly with no demand for pity. Afterward, my mother sat beside me and said, "Love does not know what to do with empty arms, so give it work until it learns." I have been giving mine work ever since. Elias rose slowly. For a moment he seemed about to reach for her, then stopped, unsure of the right. Clara crossed the last distance herself and placed her hand over his. It was the first time they touched without accident. Their hands were old enough to know work, loss, weather, and heat. They fit without claiming more than the moment. "Would you see the room?" he asked. "Only if you want it seen." "I do not want it unseen anymore." They climbed the stairs with a lamp between them. The north room was small, tucked under the roof, with one window looking toward the orchard. A narrow bed frame leaned against the wall, never assembled. A rocking chair sat under a sheet. On a peg hung yellow curtains, folded and faded at the creases. Clara touched them lightly. They held their color better than I expected. It was so practical, so perfectly Clara, that the room loosened around him. They opened the window a crack despite the cold, just long enough to change the air. They carried the curtains downstairs to be washed later. Clara said the room could hold her sewing machine when winter roads kept her from town, or quilts for families in need, or visiting children when apple picking brought them out in fall. Elias listened as the room gathered possible futures, none replacing the old hope, all honoring it by refusing to let emptiness have the final word. By morning, the snow had stopped. Before Elias drove her home, Clara folded the yellow curtains in a basin and poured warm water over them. The water turned gray. "Even waiting gathers dust," she said. Elias looked toward the open stair door. "Then I suppose waiting needs washing." "Everything does, eventually." The house did not forget Anna. Her Bible stayed on the parlor table. Her sampler still asked kindness to dwell there. The orchard remained hers in origin, though Clara took command of pruning with enough certainty that Elias said Anna would have surrendered the saw. Thomas was not forgotten either. Clara spoke of him more easily now, often while doing something useful. Thomas liked molasses cookies. Thomas hated turnips. Thomas once tried to build a chicken coop with no door and insisted he meant to do it that way. Elias laughed at that longer than Clara expected, partly because he could picture it, and partly because her affection held no bitterness. Their dead were no longer locked behind separate doors. They had become stories allowed to sit in lamplight. One February evening, Elias found himself alone after Clara had gone. Snow tapped lightly at the windows. On the table lay a thimble she had forgotten, small, silver, and dented at the rim. He He picked it up and held it in his palm. There had been a time when any object left by another person would have disturbed the order of his grief. Now the thimble looked right base around it. A dead wife's marked pages. A living woman's thimble. Not rivals. Not replacements. Two evidences that he had been loved in different seasons, and that God had not required him to live forever in only one. The realization frightened him enough that he nearly stepped back. Instead, he went to the kitchen, poured 2 cups of coffee before remembering he was alone, and sat down hard. Clara faced her own reckoning 2 days later at Nathan's table. She was patching his work shirt while he carved a new bung for a barrel. Snow melt dripped from the eaves. Nathan watched her pull the stitches too tight. "You fixing that shirt or punishing it?" "The seam is stubborn." "Seam looks innocent from here." She gave him an older sister's look, and he wisely set down the wood. "Clara, are you waiting for Elias Reed to ask what everyone knows he ought to ask?" "Everyone knows too much." "Maybe. But I know you. You are happier coming from that ranch than from anywhere else." She folded the shirt. "Happiness is not simple." "Never said it was." "I loved Thomas." "I know." "I still do, in the way one loves someone beyond needing supper kept warm." Nathan nodded. "And Elias loved Anna." "I know that too." Clara smoothed the patch with her palm. "Then what are we doing?" Her brother's face softened. "Maybe you are learning that love is not a room with one chair." The words stayed with her. She carried them to the sewing circle, the mercantile, and the Reed place the following Monday when the air smelled of thawing earth. Elias was repairing a loose porch board. Clara stepped around him and went into the kitchen as she always did. But the house felt different, as if both of them had reached the same question by separate roads. She made tea because she refused to drink his afternoon coffee. He came in, washed, and sat across from her. Between them lay her sewing basket and his half-balanced account book. "Clara," he said. She looked up. He closed the book. "I do not know the proper way to speak at our age. Plainly usually serves." He rested his hands on the table. "You have brought life back into this house." Her eyes lowered because praise can be harder to receive than criticism when it touches the truth. "I do not mean curtains and bread only," Elias said, "though I have come to respect both. I mean, you made me see that keeping a thing unchanged is not the same as keeping it loved." Clara's fingers tightened around her cup. "I have nothing grand to offer. This ranch, this house, a stubborn man with a sore back when weather turns, and more memories than some women would care to share space with." "You think my trunk is empty?" He smiled faintly. "No." "Then do not speak as if I come without my own ghosts. I would make room for them." The sentence sat between them, humble and enormous. Clara looked toward the hall. The parlor door stood open, blue-flowered curtains glowing in pale winter light. "Elias, what are you asking?" He swallowed. "I am asking if you would consider making this your home. As my wife, if your heart allows it. As Clara, with all that name carries." For a moment, the kitchen clock seemed louder than the whole world. Clara pressed one hand to her mouth, then lowered it. "My heart is not young." "Mine either. It has old roots." "Good.
This soil is hard on shallow things." She laughed through tears she had not meant to shed. Elias stood, unsure again, and again she saved him by reaching for his hand. "Yes," she said, "but I will not be tucked into a corner of Anna's house. No. And Thomas comes with me in stories, recipes, and one very ugly brown quilt he loved. Then the quilt comes too. You may regret that. I have faced bitter marmalade. I am not easily frightened." She laughed fully, and he held her hand with both of his. Nothing about the moment was youthful, and nothing about it was small. Two people who had known loss stood in a kitchen with blue curtains, choosing life without asking the past to disappear. They married in April, when orchard buds opened pink and white and the road to town dried firm enough for wagons. The ceremony was simple and crowded. Clara wore a dove-gray dress she had altered herself with her mother's green glass buttons sewn down the front. Elias wore his dark coat brushed clean at the cuffs and a new shirt Mrs. Barlow claimed had required 3 women and divine assistance to finish in secret. Nathan stood beside Clara. The pastor spoke of patience, mercy, and seasons appointed for planting and harvest. When Elias promised to cherish her, his voice trembled once. Clara squeezed his hand, and he steadied. At the supper afterward, there were biscuits, gravy, pickled beets, apple butter, pear preserves, spice cake, custard pie, and 3 kinds of coffee because nobody trusted Elias's measure. Mrs. Barlow cried into a napkin and denied it. When they drove back to the ranch at sunset, the wagon bed held parcels, quilts, jars, flour, and the ugly brown quilt folded like a challenge. Clara sat beside Elias with her wedding gloves in her lap. For the first time, she approached the Reed house not as a visitor with bread or curtains, but as a woman coming home. The porch had been swept. The front door was open, not wide, only enough for lamplight to show through. Clara saw it when he helped her down. "You left the door open." "I did." "That is not like you." "No," he said. "It is like us, I hope." They carried parcels inside. Clara placed her bonnet on the peg by the door, and Elias felt a fullness in his chest over the plainness of it. A bonnet on a peg, gloves on the table, a woman's step crossing from kitchen to hall without asking permission. He had thought grand changes would announce themselves with thunder. Instead, they arrived as ordinary things taking their rightful places. Clara did not sweep Anna away. She moved in with respect and firmness, which was the only way she knew how to live. Anna's Bible stayed in the parlor, but Clara's mother's button box joined it on the lower shelf. The blue flowered curtains remained, but Clara added lace she had tatted in winter. Thomas's brown quilt went over the kitchen rocker, where Elias declared it improved the room by making every other object look prettier. Clara swatted his shoulder with a dish towel. They built routines. Elias rose first, stirred the stove, and carried in wood. Clara made coffee properly and taught him that boiling it into submission was not a virtue. On Wednesdays, she went to Sewing Circle, and Elias drove her when roads were rough, waiting at the mercantile with other husbands who pretended they had business there. Marriage did not make Elias talkative, but it made his silences easier to enter. Clara learned the quiet that meant peace, the quiet that meant worry, and the quiet that meant his back ached, but he would deny it until supper. Elias learned that Clara hummed when content, grew sharp when frightened, and needed to finish a seam before answering any question more serious than whether she wanted tea. They disagreed over coffee, apples, and tools borrowed by careless neighbors. Once, when Elias tried to refuse payment from a man who kept returning broken implements, Clara said kindness without boundaries became a chore for the person left sweeping up. Elias said the neighbor was hard-pressed. Clara said so were the tools. They compromised by accepting payment in fence work, and the next borrowed shovel came back cleaned and oiled. One late May evening, the tidal moment came. Rain had passed at noon, leaving the yard fresh and the orchard dripping. Clara had spent the afternoon sorting quilts in the north room. Elias had ridden fence and returned tired with mud on his boots and a faraway look. Supper was simple: beans, cornbread, sliced apples, and coffee. Afterward, they sat on the porch, watching clouds turn rose over the pasture. The front door stood open behind them. From inside came the low sounds of a lived-in house, the stove settling, the parlor clock ticking, a chair creaking as wood cooled. Elias looked through the doorway toward the hall. Every room was open: kitchen, parlor, spare room, stair door, north room above. Lamplight reached across rugs, thresholds, and the bottom step. "What is it?" Clara asked. Elias turned his hat in his hands. "I spent years saying my house was too empty." She waited. "I said it to the walls, mostly. To the barn. To God a time or two, though I did not much like what I thought he might answer. My house is too empty. That was my complaint. My excuse, too, I reckon." Clara leaned back in the porch chair, evening light soft on her face. "Then you came," he said, "with bread and curtains and questions no polite person would ask." I recall being very polite. "You were polite like a plow is polite to hard ground." She smiled. He looked at the open door again. "I said, my house is too empty." Clara reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. "Then open the door." The words were gentle, but they traveled through him like a church bell. Not because they were new, but because they were what she had been saying from the beginning. With bread on the porch, curtains at the window, soup on the stove, and her hand steady over his when the north room finally breathed again. Open the door. To the house. To grief. To memory. To supper guests. Muddy children. Donated fabric. Strong coffee corrected by love. And a brown quilt ugly enough to humble pride. To love. Not as a replacement for what had been lost, but as proof that loss had not taken everything. Elias held her hand and watched the last light fade from the pasture. "I am grateful you knocked. I am grateful you let me in. Eventually." Eventually is still a kind of arrival. Years later, people in Dry Creek would shorten the story. They would say, "Old Elias Reed lived alone too long, and Widow Whitcomb came with bread and opened him like a stuck window." They would laugh about the curtains, the coffee, the ugly quilt, and the way Mrs. Barlow claimed credit because she once dropped a spool of thread at the right moment. The truer version was quieter. It was a man standing before a closed parlor with a lamp in his hand, realizing grief had become the lock, and love might be the key. It was a woman who knew empty rooms of her own and did not fear his. It was choke cherry preserves eaten at last, yellow curtains washed in a basin, a snowstorm, a proposal beside a half-balanced account book, and two people brave enough to let their memories sit together at the same table. The lesson was never that sorrow disappears when love arrives. Sorrow is not so easily dismissed, and love worth having would not ask such a thing. The lesson was that a heart can become a locked house without meaning to. At first, one door shuts to survive a hard season. Then another closes to keep the draft out. Then a whole wing goes dark, and the person living there begins to believe darkness is loyalty. But loyalty to the dead is not the same as refusal to live. The ones who loved us well would not ask us to keep every room cold in their honor. Clara knew that. Elias learned it. Together, they made a home where memory had a chair but did not own the table. They opened windows. They fed travelers. They gave children a place to sleep when roads washed out. They let neighbors laugh in the parlor and quilts pile in the north room. On winter nights, Elias would sometimes rise before bed and walk through the house. Clara knew the sound of his steps. Kitchen, parlor, hall, spare room, stair, north room. He no longer walked like a caretaker checking a tomb. He walked like a man blessing what had been entrusted to him. If a door had swung shut in the draft, he opened it. If a lamp needed trimming, he trimmed it. If Clara's sewing lay across a chair, he folded it badly, and she corrected him in the morning with affection disguised as complaint. Once, she found him outside in the cold, looking at the lit windows. "You will freeze admiring your own house," she said. "I was thinking, that is how men get cold." He smiled. "I used to come home and see only what was missing." Clara leaned against his arm. "And now?" He looked at the kitchen lamp, the parlor fire, the north room window, and the snow moving through the light. "Now I see what was given forward." By the time Elias banked the stove and Clara set the latch each night, the house was quiet. But it was no longer empty. It held old songs and new laughter. It held grief washed clean enough to breathe. It held curtains with backbone, coffee made properly, and a brown quilt nobody admired but everyone reached for when the room was cold. It held two people who had learned that the heart, like a frontier home, was built to shelter more than yesterday. If anyone asked Elias what changed everything, he might take a long time answering, because he was still not a man to spend words carelessly. Then he would look toward Clara's bread cooling under a towel, Anna's sampler asking kindness to dwell, and the stairs leading to a room full of folded quilts. He would say he once believed an empty house was proof of all he had lost. But a practical widow taught him a better truth. Sometimes the house is empty because life has been hard. Sometimes it is empty because we keep turning the key from the inside. And sometimes grace stands on the porch with bread in its hands, waiting for us to open the door.